Number 3. Gary Ray Bowles. In the spring of 1994, 59-year-old John Hardy Roberts lived in Daytona Beach, Florida. He was an insurance salesman who lived alone. On March 15, 1994, a friend of Roberts called the police. They had found him dead in the living room of his home. He had been beaten in the back of the head with the base of a lamp. A towel was then shoved down his throat, and this is what killed him. Roberts put up a big fight while he was being murdered. One of his fingernails was broken. There were no signs of a break-in. Roberts' car and wallet were stolen. The police quickly developed a suspect, 32-year-old Gary Ray Bowles. Bowles' fingerprints and probation papers were found in Roberts' home. Bowles was born in Clifton Forge, Virginia in January 1962. His father, a coal miner, died of black lung disease when his mother was still pregnant with him. Bowles grew up in Rupert, West Virginia. His mother married several times, and the first 2 men she married were abusive. When Bowles was 11, he started drinking, smoking marijuana, and huffing glue. 2 years later, at age 13, he retaliated against the abuse he suffered at the hands of his second stepfather. He nearly killed him when he bashed him in the head with a rock. His mother stayed with the man. So when Bowles was 14, he ran away from home and lived on the streets. He made money doing gay sex work. In 1982, while living in Tampa, Florida, he was convicted of severely assaulting and raping his girlfriend. One of the detectives on the case said, quote, "I've seen better looking bodies in an autopsy," unquote. Bowles was sentenced to 8 years of prison. 9 years later, in July 1991, he was convicted of pushing a woman and stealing her purse, and he was sentenced to 5 years of prison. He served 2 years. On the evening of April 13, 1994, 39-year-old David Jarman was drinking at a bar in Silver Spring, Maryland. He was seen leaving the bar with a young man. The next day, a maintenance man found Jarman's body in his apartment. He had been strangled to death, and rags had been stuffed into his mouth. His credit cards were stolen. Once again, Bowles' fingerprints were at the crime scene, but he was long gone. Milton Bradley was a 72-year-old disabled World War II veteran. In the spring of 1994, he lived in Savannah, Georgia. On May 5, 1994, his dead body was found on a golf course close to his home. Rags had been stuffed into his mouth, and he had been strangled to death. The police found Bowles' palm print at his home. But once again, Bowles was nowhere to be found. On May 13, 1994, 47-year-old Alvison Carter was found stabbed to death in his Atlanta, Georgia apartment. By the time his body was found, he had been dead for several days. On May 19, 1994, 37-year-old Albert L.C. Morris was supposed to work at his parents' convenience store in Hillard, Florida. When he did not show up for work, one of his friends went to his mobile home and noticed his car was gone. They entered the home and found his dead body. Morris had been strangled and shot in the chest with a shotgun. The police talked to Morris's friends and family. They said about a week earlier he met a man at a gay bar who went by the name Joey Pearson. Morris had let him move into his home. The police showed them a photo of Gary Bowles, and they said that was the man who called himself Joey Pearson. Morris's credit cards were also missing. The investigators learned it was last used in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. During his murder spree, Bowles was featured on the TV program America's Most Wanted 5 times, but it did not lead to his arrest. About 5 months after his last murder, on November 19, 1994, the FBI added Gary Bowles to their most wanted list. They had linked him to 3 homicides, Milton Bradley's, David Jarman, and Albert Morris's, and they strongly suspected he had killed John Roberts. At the time, they did not realize he had killed Alverson Carter. 47-year-old Walter Hinton lived in Jacksonville, Florida, and he worked as a floral designer. On November 20th, 1994, he did not show up for work. His sister went to his mobile home and found a gory scene. Someone had dropped a 40-pound cinder block onto his head. He had also been strangled, and toilet paper was stuffed down his throat. His car and credit cards were missing. Robert Cook was a rookie with the Sheriff's Department in Duval County, where Jacksonville is located. In his spare time, he was helping investigate Walter Hinton's murder. The police learned that recently, Hinton had been living with a man only known as Tim. Cook decided to look at the files of people who had recently been arrested. He discovered that a man named Timothy Whitfield had been arrested 2 days before the murder for public drunkenness. Cook talked to some of his informants and learned that Whitfield lived in a low-end rooming house and did odd jobs. On November 22nd, 2 days after Hinton's body was found, Cook got a call on his pager. His informant had spotted Whitfield. Cook called the Sheriff's Department, and one of his fellow deputies picked up Whitfield. Initially, Whitfield denied killing Walter Hinton. But then he said, quote, "Do you know who I really am? I'm a wanted man," unquote. Whitfield then admitted he was Gary Bowles. His fingerprints were taken, and it confirmed he was actually Bowles. Bowles then confessed to the 6 murders. He said he found documents, like a birth certificate, belonging to the real Timothy Whitfield at the home of his second-last victim, Albert Morris. Whitfield was Morris's cousin. He used his birth certificate to get a driver's license and then lived under that identity for months. He said he usually met his victims at gay bars. He said he was straight, but accepted money from his victims to perform sexual acts on him. He also quickly moved into their homes. Bowles said he had an alcohol use disorder. He'd eventually get drunk and snap, and then kill them. In May 1996, Bowles pleaded guilty to the murder of Walter Hinton, the last man he killed. Months later, September 1996, he was sentenced to death. In October 1996, Bowles pleaded guilty to the murder of Albert Morris, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Then, in August 1997, he pleaded guilty to the 3rd murder he committed in Florida, which was the first murder in his 8-month murder spree, the killing of John Roberts. He was given another life sentence. He never went to trial for the other 3 murders he committed. In August 1998, Bowles' death sentence was overturned. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor talked about how Bowles hated gay people. However, this wasn't relevant to the case because there was no evidence that Bowles killed Walter Hinton because he was gay. This could have unfairly prejudiced the jury, who recommended the death penalty. In September 1999, Bowles was sentenced to death again. He sat on death row for nearly 20 years. His death date was August 22, 2018. He was scheduled to be executed at 6 p.m., but the United States Supreme Court was reviewing 2 applications for a stay of execution. They ultimately chose not to grant Bowles a stay. Bowles' last meal was 3 cheeseburgers, fries, and bacon. Then, shortly after 10:30 p.m., he was led to the death chamber at the Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida. He did not have any last words. The lethal injection process started at 10:44 p.m., and 14 minutes later, 57-year-old Gary Ray Bowles was pronounced dead. Afterward, a 2-page last-written statement authored by Bowles was given to the media. He wrote, quote, "I want to start by saying that I am so very sorry to all the families and friends of Mr. Hinton. I never wanted to kill him, and I'm sorry for all the pain and suffering I have caused. I hope my death erases your pain," unquote. He also addressed his mother in his letter, writing, quote, "Having to deal with your son being called a monster is terrible. I'm so very sorry. I never wanted this to be my life. You don't wake up one day and decide to become a serial killer, unquote. The police do not believe that the 6 men are Bowles' only victims. They had asked him if he had killed any women, and he never said yes or no. A detective said he just hemmed and hawed. However, at the time of this recording, no other murders have been attributed to Gary Bowles since he was executed. Number 2. David Alan Gore. In 1981, the Lings family lived in Vero Beach, Florida. They lived in a remote area where their closest neighbors were a mile away. The family of 4 had immigrated from Taiwan a few years earlier. On February 19, 1981, at 2:45 p.m., Pu Ling left the family home to go to work. He worked as a state citrus inspector. When he left, his 48-year-old wife, Sang Hong Ling, was cleaning their home. About 15 minutes later, their daughter, 17-year-old Ling Hao Ling, was dropped off by the school bus about half a mile from their home. She usually walked home alone. When Pu and Sang's 12-year-old son arrived home at around 4 p.m., he was surprised to find no one there. The police were called. The vacuum cleaner was standing idle in the middle of the living room, and it was still plugged in. Ying had also made it home because her jacket and school books were there. In the dirt driveway, the police found 2 scuff marks. The police said it could have been made by someone being dragged, but they acknowledged that there could be a more innocent explanation as for how the drag marks got there. There were massive searches for the mother and daughter, but they were nowhere to be found. 35-year-old Julie Daley, who went by her middle name, Kay, was married and had 2 teenage daughters. They lived in Belmont, California. Judy had previously lived in Vero Beach, and in July 1981, she and her 2 daughters were visiting Vero Beach. On July 15, 1981, Kay dropped her daughters off at J.C. Park Beach. She planned to sunbathe at Round Island Park, about 8 miles south. When Kay was in high school, it was a popular hangout spot for teenagers. But in 1981, it was a secluded beach. Kay and her daughters were staying with Kay's sister-in-law and brother-in-law, Paul and Bonnie Shui. Just before 2 p.m., Bonnie received a call from a man. He said that Judy Kay Daley's car had broken down in North Beach. The man said she had asked him to call Paul Shui. The man called again 5 minutes later and told Bonnie that someone needed to pick up her daughters at the beach. Bonnie talked to her husband, and they thought that several things about the call were odd. For example, the man said that her name was Judy Kay Daley, and Kay would have never introduced herself that way. She would tell people her name was Kay. But Judy Kay Daley was printed on her driver's license. Also, they knew that Kay was going to Round Island Park, not North Beach. Finally, there was the car that Kay was driving. Paul drove that car 27 miles daily and knew nothing was wrong with it. A neighbor picked up Kay's daughters, and Paul went to North Beach, where the caller said the car was parked. But the car was not there. He then went to Round Island Park, where Kay said she was going, and found the car parked there. He opened the hood and immediately noticed a few things were off. The rod that held up the hood wasn't in its bracket. Also, the engine's coil wire had been pulled. He reattached the coil, and the car started without a problem. The police were called. They believe that Kay had been kidnapped. They think the kidnapper sabotaged the car, then lured her into his vehicle with the offer of helping her. There were massive searches for the 35-year-old wife and mother of 2, but no traces of her were found. Barbara Ann Byer and Angelica Lavallee were both 14 and lived in Orlando, Florida. On May 19, 1983, the pair ran away from home. They were reported missing, but since they were runaways, there was no official search for the girls. Then, a few months later, on July 26, 1983, a 16-year-old boy in Vero Beach called the police. He had witnessed something disturbing. He was riding his bike when he saw a nude man running after a naked woman. She fell and he tried to drag her back into the house, but she was fighting back. Then the boy heard 2 gunshots. The police arrived at the home and they found a pool of blood under a parked car. They forced the trunk open, and inside they found the nude-bound dead body of a young woman. She was later identified as 17-year-old Lynn Elliott. Then the police realized that someone was in the house. They discovered it was 29-year-old David Alan Gore. Gore refused to come out, and a standoff ensued. 2 of his aunts arrived at the scene, and they told the police that his cousin, Fred Waterfield, might be able to talk him out of the house. Sheriff's deputies retrieved Waterfield from the auto repair garage where he worked as a mechanic. However, by the time Waterfield arrived, the police had entered the house and found Gore hiding in the loft. They were shocked to discover he wasn't alone. With him was a bound, naked teenage girl who was alive. She was 14-year-old Reagan Martin. Gore was arrested. Reagan told the police that she and Lynn had been hitchhiking to Wabasso Beach. Gore and another man picked them up. They gave them beer and then offered them marijuana. Then Gore pulled out a gun and held it to their heads. He then handcuffed them together and ordered them to keep their heads down. They were brought into different rooms when they got into the house, and then the second man left. Gore went back and forth between the rooms, taking turns sexually assaulting the teenage girls. Reagan said she heard Lynn flee, then she heard 2 gunshots. Gore came back inside and forced her into the loft. As Reagan was being led out of the house after she was rescued, she saw Fred Waterfield and identified him as the other man who kidnapped her. 30-year-old Waterfield was arrested. Gore and Waterfield were cousins, but they were as close as brothers. Gore and Waterfield were very different in several ways. Waterfield was a star high school football player. He was considered funny, outgoing, and popular. He had dated many young women. Gore was a quiet loner who had only dated 1 girl in high school. She later said he never wanted to do anything sexual. Many people considered Waterfield to be the leader and Gore to be the one who followed. Months after the cousins were arrested, in November 1983, Gore confessed to the 6 murders. He said he had been stalking Ying Ling, so he knew what time she got home from school. At the time, Gore was an auxiliary sheriff's deputy. He showed her his badge and told her she needed to come with him. They returned to her home, where her mother, Sang Hu Ling, was cleaning. He kidnapped her as well. He took them to a shack in an orange grove where he worked as a foreman, and he raped both the mother and daughter. He then shot Sang. He called his cousin, Fred Waterfield, and they took turns raping Ying. Waterfield then told him to get rid of her, so he shot her as well. Gore then dismembered them, then put their remains in 30-gallon drum barrels. He then buried the barrels in a different orange grove. About 6 months later, he came across Kay Daley, who went to the beach alone. He sabotaged her car, then when she couldn't start it, he approached her and told her he was a sheriff's deputy. He offered her a ride. After she was in his truck, he pulled out a gun and handcuffed her. He took her to a trailer at the orange grove where he worked. Waterfield joined him and they took turns raping her. Gore said that he strangled the mother of 2 to death. Afterward, he dismembered her body, put the body parts in garbage bags, and buried the bags in a citrus grove west of the city. 2 weeks later, on July 14th, Gore pulled over an 18-year-old girl in a traffic stop. He told her that there had been a burglary in the area, and her car matched the description of the vehicle used in the robbery. He told her she needed to follow him in her car. He led her to an isolated area, but a man spotted them, so Gore abandoned his plans to rape her. The young woman was so disturbed by the incident, she reported it to the sheriff's department. There was an internal investigation, and 3 days after the incident, on July 17th, he resigned as an auxiliary deputy. Less than 2 weeks later, on July 31st, Gore spotted a 23-year-old woman at a doctor's office. He got into the back of her car and waited for her to come out. She saw him and called the police. A deputy found him in the car shirtless with a jar of vodka, a police scanner, handcuffs, and a .357 Magnum. Gore was arrested. He went to trial in October 1991. He was convicted of armed trespassing. Weeks later, he was sentenced to 5 years of prison. He served 18 months and he was released in March 1983. 2 months later, on May 17, 1983, Gore said that he and Waterfield were driving and they encountered Barbara Byer and Angelica Lavallee, who were both 14, while they were hitchhiking. They raped both girls and then Gore shot them in the back of the head. He dismembered Barbara's body and dumped her remains in a citrus grove. He dumped Angelica's body in a canal. Months later, he and Waterfield were driving in Waterfield's truck. They came across 17-year-old Lynn Elliott and 14-year-old Reagan Martin, who were hitchhiking. They passed Waterfield's sister on the drive to Gore's parents. This spooked Waterfield, so he helped get the girls into the home that he left. These were not the only crimes the cousins committed. When they were both 18, they sexually assaulted Gore's sister. When Gore was 22, in July 1976, he and Waterfield shot the tires of a 27-year-old woman who was pulling out of a gas station. They pulled up to her and asked if she needed any help. Then Waterfield pulled out a gun and tried to force her to get into their vehicle. But then a car approached them and the woman ran. She got into that car and they drove away. She reported the incident but didn't realize it was Gore and Waterfield until after they were arrested. A month after that, a 20-year-old woman asked Waterfield for help with her car. It was parked outside the mobile home she shared with her husband and it had 2 flat tires. Waterfield, who was an auto mechanic, was friends with her husband. Waterfield and Gore picked her up in Waterfield's Lincoln Continental. They drove her to a remote citrus grove. They took turns raping her at gunpoint. They ended up letting her go if she promised not to tell anyone. That night she went to the hospital and reported the assault to the police. Gore and Waterfield were arrested. They were questioned and they said that the sex was consensual, so they were never charged. In December 1983, Gore led the police to the remains of 3 of his victims, Sang-Hung Ling, Ying-Hung Ling, and Barbara Byer. Months later, in June 1984, based on information given to them by Gore, the remains of Kay Daley were found. The body of Angelica Lavallee, who Gore said he dumped into the canal, was never found. Fred Waterfield denied having anything to do with the murders. David Gore went to trial in March 1984 for the murder of Lynn Elliott and the kidnapping of Reagan Martin. The trial lasted a week and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Gore was found guilty. The jury then voted 11-1 in favor of sentencing him to death. In Florida, you need 8 or more jury members to vote in favor of the death penalty for a defendant to be sentenced to death. So Gore was given the death sentence. In May 1984, Fred Waterfield went to trial for the first-degree murder of Lynn Elliott and the kidnapping of Reagan Martin. After a 13-day trial, he was acquitted of first-degree murder and kidnapping, but he was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury said that there was not enough evidence to convict him of first-degree murder and kidnapping. In July 1984, he was sentenced to the maximum, 15 years of prison. Gore pleaded guilty to the 5 other murders, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Fred Waterfield went to trial in January 1985 for the murders of Barbara Ann Byer and Angelica Lavallee. The defense argued that Gore was the mastermind, and Waterfield was shocked when he pulled out a gun. Also, according to Gore's confession, Gore was the one who shot them. Gore testified against his cousin. Waterfield's lawyer argued that the only evidence against Waterfield was Gore's testimony, and he pointed out that Gore was a sexually depraved serial killer. The trial lasted for 9 days, then the jury deliberated for 3 hours and 18 minutes. Waterfield was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was given 2 consecutive life sentences. It was decided that he would not be tried for the murders of Sang-Hu Ling, her daughter Ying-Hu Ling, and Kay Daley. After several delays, David Alan Gore's execution date was scheduled for April 12, 2012. For his last meal, he was served fried chicken, french fries, a soft drink, and buttered pecan ice cream for dessert. Then, after 28 years on death row, Gore was led to the death chamber of the Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. Gore was asked if he had any last words. He said that after he was arrested, he became a Christian. He then said, quote, "I want to say to the Elliott family, I'm sorry for the death of your daughter. I'm not the same man I was back then, 28 years ago. I hope they can find it in their hearts to forgive me," unquote. Shortly after 6 p.m., the lethal injection process began. 58-year-old David Alan Gore was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. At the time of this recording, Gore's cousin and partner in crime, 71-year-old Fred Waterfield, is serving a sentence at the Marion Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. Number 1. Arthur Bishop. On October 16, 1979, around noon, 4-year-old Alonzo Daniels was playing outside in the courtyard of the apartment building where he lived with his mother in Salt Lake City, Utah. His mother was just 14 when she gave birth to him. When his mother went out to find him, he was gone. She called the police. There was a massive search for the young boy, but no trace of him was found. 11 months later, on November 27, 1980, 11-year-old Kim Peterson left his home in Salt Lake City. Kim was going to meet a man to sell him his roller skates. Kim loved roller skating and often hung out in the city's roller skating rinks. His parents told him to bring the man back to their home. Kim never returned home, and he was reported missing. At the time, no one connected the 2 disappearances. 11 months after that, a 3rd boy went missing in Salt Lake City. On October 20th, 1981, 4-year-old Danny Davis was grocery shopping with his grandfather. At a section with toys, Danny stayed to look at them while his grandfather continued shopping. When his grandfather went back to get Danny, he was gone. A massive search was conducted. This included the police going door to door. Once again, no trace of the boy was found. A week later, the police said that the 3 cases might be linked. 3 boys went missing in as many years. Plus, they all went missing within 2 weeks of Halloween. However, there was no evidence that they were connected. But the similarities were striking enough that the police publicly said that the 3 disappearances could be linked. June 22, 1983 was Troy Ward's 6th birthday. He lived with his mother in Salt Lake City. That afternoon, his mother went to the store to get cake and ice cream for his birthday. While she was gone, he waited on a street corner for a ride on a motorcycle from a neighborhood friend. Then, he seemingly vanished into thin air. Less than a month later, on July 16, 1983, 13-year-old Graham Cunningham was going to leave on a camping trip to California with his friend and his friend's stepfather. 2 days before he was to leave, Graham got a phone call. He told his mother he had to go out, but he would return shortly. He didn't tell her where he was going. Graham never returned home. His mother reported him missing. On the day Graham was supposed to leave for the trip, he still had not been found. Graham's friend told Graham's mom that he would stay and help look for him, but Graham's mother told him to go on the trip. The police were suspicious of the friend and stepfather. It turned out that wasn't their relationship. The 13-year-old boy just regularly hung out with the 30-year-old man. The man's name was Roger Downs. Then someone realized that Downs had been questioned in at least 2 of the other disappearances. Downs lived in an apartment across the hallway from Alonzo Daniels. He lived half a block from the grocery store where Danny Davis was kidnapped. Both times he was questioned in a door-to-door search. The police discovered that Roger Downs was not the man's real name. He was Arthur Gary Bishop. Bishop was born in Hinckley, Utah in September 1952. He was the oldest of 6 boys. Bishop and his family were devout members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. When he was 19, he went to the Philippines for missionary work. He was a good student and an Eagle Scout. When he was 26, he was convicted of embezzling over $8,000 from a used car dealership where he worked. He was ordered to repay the money and was given a 5-year suspended sentence. Shortly after the conviction, he left Hinckley and moved to Salt Lake City. He did not tell his probation officer he had moved. He also took on a new identity, Lynn Jones. In Salt Lake City, he volunteered for the Big Brother organization. For a year, he was a big brother to a 10-year-old boy. But then he was forced out because there were allegations he had molested 2 boys. Neither victim was the boy he was a big brother to. Around the time of the murder of Alonzo, he started using the name Roger Downs. Since Bishop had disappeared after his conviction, there was a warrant out for his arrest. So when he returned from California on June 25, 1983, he was arrested. In custody, he admitted that he was Arthur Bishop. He also confessed to the murders of the 5 boys. He said that he lured 4-year-old Alonzo into his apartment by offering him candy. He tried to assault him sexually, and Alonzo started crying. Bishop said he was worried that Alonzo would tell his mother. So he brought him into the bathroom, where he struck him in the head with a hammer. This knocked him to the floor, but he wasn't unconscious. He kept crying for his mother. So he hit him in the head again, and this knocked him unconscious. He then put him in the bathtub and drowned him. Afterward, he fondled the body, and according to some reports, he sexually mutilated the body. He then put the body in a box and carried the box out to his car. He walked right by Alonzo's mother, who was calling out for him. He drove to an area outside the city, Cedar Valley, and buried the body in a shallow grave. Bishop said that night, when the police knocked on the door and questioned him, he was ready to confess. But they didn't ask him if he committed the murder. They just asked him basic things, like if he saw anything unusual. Shortly after the murder, he moved out. Over the next 13 months, he adopted 10 to 15 puppies. He found joy in killing them because they made the same sounds as Alonzo. During this time, he met a 10-year-old boy who was only identified with pseudonyms and initials. Like many reports, we'll call him John. John's father had been murdered in a bar fight, and his mother didn't spend much time with him. Bishop gave John money and gifts. He also gave his mother money. Bishop sexually abused the young boy. John introduced Bishop to his friends. One of them was 13-year-old Kim Peterson. Bishop said that Kim told him he had roller skates he wanted to sell. Bishop feigned interest in buying them. The next day, Bishop called Kim and asked if he could meet him about the roller skates. They met up, and Bishop told him he wasn't interested in the roller skates, but he offered Kim money to go hunting with him. Kim agreed to go. They drove to Cedar Valley, close to the area where he had buried the body of Alonzo. Once there, he offered Kim $100 to take nude photos of him, and he reluctantly agreed. Kim said that he wanted him to pay him weekly, or he would tell his parents about the photos. Bishop didn't like this, so he shot the boy 3 times and sexually abused the body. He then went and bought a shovel. He returned and sexually mutilated the body. He then buried the body. Bishop said that he came across 4-year-old Danny Davis at the grocery store while he was looking at toys. He offered to give the boy toys if he followed him. Danny followed him out of the store. He then carried the 4-year-old boy to his apartment. After a while, he suffocated him by blocking off his air passages with his hand. He said that he did not sexually abuse the boy. He put his body in 2 garbage bags and put it in the corner of the room. Then John and several of his friends arrived and they watched pornographic movies. After they left, Bishop put the body in the trunk of his car. The next morning, 2 police officers came to his home during the door-to-door search. They asked him if he had seen Danny, and he said he hadn't. At the time, the body was in the trunk of his car, which was parked a few feet away. The officers walked by his car when they left. They had no idea that the body of the boy they were looking for was inches away from them. After eating some breakfast, Bishop drove to the same area where he buried the 2 other bodies. He came across 6-year-old Troy Ward, who was waiting for a ride on a motorcycle. Bishop told him he was lost and looking for a nearby park. He offered Troy ice cream if he got into the car and directed him to the park. He took him to his home, where he handcuffed and bound him. He sexually abused him. He then beat him to death with a rubber mallet. He then put the body into the trunk of his car. Bishop had decided to change the method of hiding the bodies. When he was last in the area where he buried his previous victims, he discovered animals had unearthed parts of one of the bodies, so he had to bury the remains again. He had also read a news story about a kid dying in a rafting accident on the river, and his body had never been recovered. So he dumped the body into Big Cottonwood Creek. Bishop met 13-year-old Graham Cunningham through the boy known as John. Before the planned camping trip to California with Bishop and John, Graham was trying to get some spending money. Bishop was growing marijuana in his basement. He called Graham, who knew about the marijuana, and asked him if he could make a delivery. When Graham arrived, he had a different offer for him. He said he would buy him a skateboard on the trip if he posed nude for a couple of photos. Graham reluctantly agreed. Bishop said that he became paranoid about Graham telling someone. So as the 13-year-old boy was getting dressed, he struck him twice in the head with a hammer. He then took him into the bathroom and started to fill the tub. While that was happening, Graham regained consciousness. The left side of his body was paralyzed. Bishop said he put Graham into the bathtub and held him underwater. Despite his injuries, he fought, but it was futile, and he died. Bishop said that he dumped the body in the creek. Bishop told the police that John was suspicious that he might have been involved in the disappearances, but he never accused him of killing them. Bishop also admitted to sexually abusing dozens of boys. During his confession, he giggled and sometimes imitated the boys' voices while he repeated their last words. He said, quote, "I'm glad you caught me, because I couldn't stop and would do it again if I had the chance," unquote. The next morning, he led the police to the bodies. All 5 sets of remains were found. At Bishop's home, the police found over 300 nude photos he had taken of underage boys, plus other child pornography he had not produced. 32-year-old Arthur Bishop went to trial in February 1984, 6 months after he was arrested. To say the evidence against him was overwhelming would be an understatement. He had confessed and led the police to the bodies. The police had also found several of the murder weapons, like the mallet and the gun. Bishop's lawyers acknowledged he committed the murders, but they said he should be found guilty of manslaughter and not first-degree murder because he was mentally disturbed. After a 3-week trial, the jury deliberated for 4.5 hours. He was found guilty of all 5 murders. He was sentenced to death. Bishop apologized to the victims' families. He also requested to die by lethal injection. He waived all appeals, so he was scheduled to die on June 10, 1988. He did not take a last meal. Just after midnight on June 10, 1988, 35-year-old Arthur Bishop was led to the death chamber in the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah. He was asked if he had any last words. He said, quote, "I want to offer again my most profound and heartfelt apologies to my victims' families. I am truly sorry. I have tried my best to empathize with their grief and devastation, and I hope they come to know of my concerns and prayers for them," unquote. Then the lethal injection process started. Arthur Gary Bishop was pronounced dead at 12:15 a.m., 9 minutes after the execution started. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now, and there's a link in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.